But first, I want to start with a thank you, just a mention of gratitude to CMD, to Addison for that wonderful introduction, to the group for inviting me and hosting me and representatives of the Jewish community here in Lexington. And also thank you to Hunter Presbyterian Church for being our gracious hosts this afternoon. I am relatively new to Lexington, and not long after I came, I think Addison reached out and in an attempt to sort of bring the Jewish community back into the CMD group. It used to be CMJD, right, the Christian Muslim Jewish Dialogue group, and I'm hopeful that our conversation today, our learning that we're going to do together this afternoon, is the first step in sort of opening that relationship back up again. And I'll speak for myself, but also on behalf of my congregation, Ohavay Zion, that we are really, really interested in interfaith dialogue and work, and really getting to know each other and building relationships of trust and learning together, even if that means being a little bit uncomfortable and being in places that are new to us religiously, theologically, physically. I've never been to Hunter Presbyterian before, but I'm hopeful that this is the beginning of a renewed and beautiful and really, really important relationship among the interfaith community here in Lexington. So what we're going to do today is sort of a 45-minute crash course in Judaism. And I just want to start by saying that that is just going to be the very, very tip of the iceberg. I'm sure everyone here who is involved in their own faith traditions knows that you can't possibly cover the whole of it in 45 minutes. Even if we had a whole year where we were studying together, we still would just be touching scratching the surface. And so I say that to both manage and set expectations that we're not going to cover everything, and also extend an invitation. You know, if there's something that you are still curious about or you don't feel was really explained very well, please know that I'm always available and would love to continue the conversation. So before we get into, and the text is so small anyway, so I'm happy to send these slides out afterward. So before getting into a conversation about what is Judaism, what is Jewish faith, it's really important to set the stage and start by saying that there is no one singular answer to that question. And one thing that Jews are famous for is having a million questions to one seemingly very simple question. And so in a way, our conversation today is going to sort of replicate and be a good metaphor for what it means to live in Jewish community and Jewish learning. But it's really important to say at the very outset of our conversation that there are many, many kinds of Jewish people. And we'll talk a little bit about the major denominations within Judaism, but that diversity, that sort of difference in thought applies to everything from how we think about God, how we approach Jewish prayer and liturgy, what we think of Jewish scriptures, and also, and it goes without saying because this is true in every and all community that we inhabit, there is a wide array of political approaches within the Jewish community on any number of topics. But one thing that's important to mention to me personally is that historically, particularly in America, Jewish people tend to, and it's, again, this is not a generalization, and doesn't speak to each specific Jewish person, but in America, Jews tend to be a little bit more politically progressive, have historically voted as Democrats. And that's just, I mentioned that just as something to keep in mind as we go forward. So the text that I wanted to start with to sort of ground our conversation in learning comes from the Babylonian Talmud, which is our essential rabbinic text. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means a little bit later on. But it was written in the first iteration of Jewish diaspora after the Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. And the rabbis in this moment of rupture are tasked with trying to figure out how Judaism is going to endure, how it's going to survive, how it will be meaningful in the absence of a temple, in the absence of a place where we could come centrally to worship. And one of the most important teachings that comes out of that document is this: both these and those are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu, divrei Elohim chayim in the Hebrew. And this is, I think, an important way to sort of ground our conversation, because I'm going to be speaking from my very specific and particular lens, and I'm sure the questions that you have, I may not be able to answer to the fullest extent that you're asking, because there is just so much diversity, so much sort of, not, I don't want to say disagreement, but important difference in how we might approach some of these questions. So we have three major denominations within Judaism. Reform Judaism, and here in Lexington, we're lucky to have a Reform congregation, Temple Adith Israel on North Ashland, if you've ever been there. We have Orthodox Judaism, and then we have the conservative denomination of Judaism, which is what I am affiliated with, and Ohavay Zion Synagogue is a conservative synagogue. And I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about what each of these mean. So the Reform movement was the first denomination to emerges in Germany, and it adopts practices of Protestant Christianity, particularly when it comes to the aesthetics of services. Service leaders and clergy wear robes, and they use an organ, and much of the service is conducted in English. And part of why this happens, part of why denominations or sort of differentiations in Jewish identity and practice emerge to begin with, is in response to the question of enlightenment and emancipation in Central Europe, right? The Jewish communities at the time are wondering, what is our relationship to the local civic and secular society in which we live? How can we participate politically? And how can we also maintain a duality, but a living together of our Jewish identity, our commitments to Jewish law and theology, while also being good German citizens or good American citizens? And this is a conversation that I think many, many people of faith have. What are my commitments, and how does my obligation to the country in which I'm living, how is it reflected in my religious commitments, and vice versa? How am I living out my faith? How am I living out my religion in service of my civic and civil political obligations? So reform is the very first. And one of the major questions of Reform Judaism is, how are we going to not only fully participate, but how can we create a Jewish life that is sort of in synthesis with the larger German Protestant community? Next, we have Orthodox Judaism, which is founded actually in response to, and in many ways in reaction to, the emergence of Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism said all of the very strict associations with Jewish law, being very conservative, let's say with a small c, about how we interpret Jewish law, having distinctions between people who are Jewish and people who are not Jewish. Orthodox Judaism emerges and says, we actually need to sort of scale it back, and we need to be very careful to maintain a difference, because we don't want Judaism to disappear. And so there are some fears around the potential risks of assimilation and emancipation. And there's a very famous saying by one of the early Orthodox rabbis, the Khatam Sofer, who says, in Hebrew, he says, Chidush asur min haTorah, which in English means anything new, right? Any innovation that you could possibly imagine to change or make Judaism a little bit more interesting is absolutely forbidden. And so this is the more conservative reaction to a Reform Judaism, which is much more open, much more progressive, and much more honest, I think, about what it means to live in the world. And then the third and final major denomination is the conservative movement, the conservative branch of Judaism, which I always, whenever I'm meeting with folks in the community, always start by saying that now in 2024, conservative is not necessarily the most appropriate name for our movement, because now we know we just live in a sort of hyper politicized and polarized world where conservative and liberal are buzzwords, and it doesn't fully, it has nothing to do with a political affiliation, and it can sometimes shut down a conversation before it really begins. But it's called conservative Judaism because it is a more conservative approach to Reform Judaism, but it is a moderate approach to Orthodox Judaism. So if we were to plot these three movements on a spectrum, on a line, you would have Reform on the left, you would have you would have Orthodoxy on the right, and you would have conservative Judaism in the middle. And our approach to Judaism in the conservative movement, in the conservative framework, is, and this wasn't always true, but now our congregations are fully egalitarian. People of all genders we see them as obligated equally under the tenets of Jewish law. So if you came to our synagogue to visit, you would see men, women, you would see queer people and transgender people participating equally in our services. And one of our main sort of the lens through which we approach religious life and theology and building a religious culture is trying to find a balance between tradition and change. And so for us, all of the decisions that we make at the congregation, the way that we sort of publicly live our Jewish life in the congregation is all deeply rooted in Jewish law, in traditional Jewish law, much in the same way that Orthodox Judaism is. But we are also taking into account, and I shouldn't even say just taking into account, but we are constantly and very seriously and genuinely grappling with changing social norms. So just as an example, the seminary where I was ordained, the Jewish Theological Seminary, wasn't always egalitarian. It only started ordaining women in 1985, which is not so long ago. And even for a long time after that, women actually, even though they were ordained, weren't permitted to serve congregation. But, after in the 70s and sort of in response to changing norms and conversations around gender in general, the conservative movement said, well, we actually have to shift the way we think about obligation. It used to be that only men and only a certain kind of man were fully obligated in Jewish observance and Jewish law, and we're going to change that. So women are now seen as fully equal under the tenets of Jewish law. Another example of this within the conservative movement is that my rabbinical school, the Jewish Theological Seminary, only started ordaining openly gay and lesbian students in 2006. So really no time at all since that change has happened, but it has transformed the Jewish world, I think, for the better, and has also shown, I think, that, and we're seeing this trend at our congregation, which I feel very fortunate for and very proud of, which is that young Jews who identify as members of the LGBTQ community know that they can find a Judaism that is rooted in serious observance and Jewish law, but that they are also fully welcome and seen as fully obligated to be there. So that's really important. And those, again, are the big three, we might call them. And then there are other Jewish denominations which are no less important, but they're just a little bit smaller in size. That's the Reconstructionist movement, which is the first American denomination, which was created by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan in the 1920s. And just as an aside, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan is someone who, he was an Orthodox rabbi, he was a conservative rabbi, he was a Reform rabbi, he created a new movement in America. He sort of spans the whole spectrum of Jewish observance in the United States. We have the Renewal movement, which was also created in America in the 20th century by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, and that has connections to a more Eastern approach to spirituality and uses practices like meditation and chant as part of their experience of liturgy. Okay, it was very hard to get all of this information on one slide, as you can see. So we all share, everyone who's in this room shares a lot of biblical text and tradition. And so here I've just laid out sort of how we think about the Hebrew Bible, but I want to start again with a teaching. And this comes from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a very prominent modern Orthodox, but also conservative Jewish philosopher and thinker. He taught for many years at the seminary where I was ordained. And he is credited with sort of transforming traditional Jewish thought into something that is much more expansive and spiritual. So you'll see his name actually a few times in our slideshow. And he says that religion is an answer to man's ultimate question. The moment we become oblivious to ultimate questions, religion becomes irrelevant and its crisis sets in. The primary task of religion is to rediscover the questions to which religion is an answer. This to me feels like a foundational approach within Judaism to encountering the Bible, encountering the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, or Tanakh, as we might refer to the whole canon, the whole biblical canon. But it's also important for me to mention, and I'll talk very briefly about this, but all of those, the three denominations, and certainly the later three, but Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative Judaism approach how they read scripture a little bit differently. I actually grew up in the Orthodox community, and we were taught that the Bible, the text of the Bible, the words of the Bible are literal, that God's self actually wrote the text. And therefore, like we saw in our first text, there was no possibility to ever deviate or really question or interpret in a slightly different way that may actually speak to you and your particular circumstance a little bit more authentically. I will say that that's not the case in every Orthodox community, but it certainly is, I would say, a framework for how they think about the Hebrew Bible. For us, for conservative Jews, we approach the Tanakh, we approach the Torah not less spiritually. It to us is our founding religious document. It is sacred, it is divinely inspired. It is the narrative that holds us all together. But we do approach it in a slightly more academic way, which is to say that we are very much in favor of biblical criticism. We have lots of spirited conversations about the character of God and the infallibility, the imperfection of God. I try to, from my perch on the pulpit, try to push against the notion that God is absolutely perfect, because that's not what we see, at least in my perspective, borne out in the text all the time. But we're a little bit more open about how we encounter God, God's character, how we read Jewish law and the biblical commandments. And that's to say that I think, like all people of faith, we really struggle with lots of pieces of the biblical text. I'm sure everyone here can point to a verse that makes them a little bit uncomfortable or uneasy. But our approach within the conservative movement is to sort of ask those big questions that are rooted in the biblical text. But in terms of our methodology, we're also just, we want to connect to the text in a deeply faithful and spiritual and religious way, and keep it as a central narrative within our community. But we read it a little bit more openly, again, which isn't to say that it's any less divine or important. And I've organized how we break down the biblical canon. We have first the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then we have the Nevi'im, the prophets. We have 21 of, and we'll talk a little bit about Shabbat in a different slide, but every Saturday we read one portion from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses. Right now we're nearing the end of Deuteronomy. It plays out over the course of a yearly cycle. And then we start it all over again at after the high holidays. And then also every week, every Saturday, we read a short section from the prophets. So every week we're coming into contact over the course of a year in a very sort of structured cyclical way with pieces from the Torah and from the prophets. And then we have a third category, which is the Ketuvim, the writings, which includes Psalms, Proverbs, Jobs, First and Second Chronicles, Lamentations, the Book of Esther. And these are texts that we primarily encounter, with the exception of Psalms, we primarily encounter these texts on the Jewish holidays. So Esther, for example, the Book of Esther, we read on the holiday of Purim. Ruth, we read on Shavuot, the holiday where we celebrate receiving revelation at Sinai. Ruth is the first, she's credited as being the first convert to Judaism. And we read her story on the holiday where we celebrate sort of becoming Jews, right? Coming into covenant with God as a way of honoring her choice to join the Jewish people, but also to acknowledge what it means to take on the blessing, the beauty, but also sometimes the burden of covenant. We read Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, when we commemorate the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem. And so all of these texts have their own special role to play in the course of the Jewish life cycle, and really give, I think, our services and our just Jewish existence over the course of the year some real texture. And then Psalms, of course, we actually encounter in almost everything that we do as Jews. We're commanded to pray 3 times a day. Each of the services contain excerpts from Psalms. Our Friday night service, our Saturday morning service, anytime you pray, you will come into contact with the Psalms. And there are also specific moments, whether on the calendar or in your personal life or a community's life, where you might choose to say some specific Psalms. And I'm sure this is true across faith traditions. There are Psalms that are typically reserved for a funeral, or when you're sitting vigil with someone who's about to pass, for burial, for other moments of crisis and tragedy. And then there are an equal number of Psalms that we say in happy occasions, in happy moments. So Psalms are really woven into the daily fabric of what it means to be a Jew. So just by show of hands, who here has ever, with a friend or relative, celebrated or been invited to a celebration of a Jewish holiday? Great, great. So again, just to ground our teaching in a teaching is a quote from Deuteronomy, and you shall celebrate your festivals and be altogether joyful. So there are certain days on the Jewish calendar that are, again, reserved for tragedy, that are moments where we specifically commemorate tragic things that have happened in Jewish history. But for the most part, and thank God, Jewish holidays are really intended to be joyous, and there's a lot of song, and there's lots of specific liturgy that we use to commemorate the holidays. But the Torah, the Bible, commands us to find joy and to create our holidays in such a way that they sort of emanate joy. So we have a couple different categories of Jewish holidays. The first and maybe most familiar are the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals, which include Pesach, Passover, Shavuot, or Pentecost, and Sukkot. Passover, we all know, it's when we celebrate our exodus from Egypt. Shavuot, just 7 weeks later, is when we commemorate the Jewish people standing at the base of Mount Sinai and being given revelation. And Sukkot, the third of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, this is the Feast of Tabernacles, where we build these temporary booths. You can see right here, where we have all of our meals, we learn, we sort of live in these Sukkot, these temporary huts, for the full week, as a way both to commemorate the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, that at each step and each stage in their journey, they built these little Sukkot, and this is how they lived as they traveled. And also to acknowledge, and Sukkot happens in the fall. We'll celebrate Sukkot at the end of October this year. And it's another way for us to acknowledge the sort of fragility of life. We step out of our sturdy homes and structures for a full week and live in this hut that has walls that are sort of flimsy and a roof that we're actually commanded, you have to be able to see the stars through the roof of the sukkah. So many people will use bamboo mats or put down, it's called schach, which is evergreen, but it's very green and very open, and it's exposed to the elements. And it's supposed to sort of call to mind how lucky we are to live in homes, if we're fortunate to have that. But it brings us out into nature, out into the world, maybe perhaps even a little bit closer to God, and helps us reflect a little bit on what we are so fortunate to have. The second category is, I would say, Shabbat and the high holidays. Shabbat, some people, when they hear that it is described as a holiday, they say, what do you mean? Like, Shabbat is not a holiday. It happens every single week. It's just rote and it's part of the rotation. But Shabbat is, in fact, a holiday that happens every single week, beginning on Friday evening and ending on Saturday night, after you can see 3 stars in the sky. And then we have the high holidays, which are coming up actually in just a couple of weeks: Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And I would say that, every day is important and precious, and every Jewish holiday is very important. But Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I would say, hold a special and unique significance and intensity. This is the opportunity that we have built into the year to turn a new leaf, to do really serious personal introspection and reflection. And on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, we sort of beg God to forgive us and write us and seal us into the book of life for the new year. And we're taught that at the end of Yom Kippur, the gates to God, right, the channels that are open wide during this season to God, actually close. And I will say that I think there are some people, some Jewish people, who really do believe that your access to God, your connection to the divine, changes after Yom Kippur ends. And if you didn't get the exact right prayer, or say you were sorry, or ask for the kind of forgiveness that you really needed, the kind of growth that you needed to do in time for, before Yom Kippur ended, that maybe you have missed a crucial opportunity. I would push back against that and just remind us, I'm sure lots of us feel this way, that the connection to God, the opportunity to talk to God, to have a personal relationship with God, is actually always there. It's just elevated to a different kind of intensity on Yom Kippur. And then we have holidays of history in Judaism, which are not, we don't, with the exception of Purim, we don't really encounter them biblically. This is Hanukkah, where we commemorate the successful Maccabean revolt against the Greeks. Purim, where we celebrate, we read the book of Esther and commemorate and then celebrate the plot that Haman, the villain, the Amalekite of the Purim story, had concocted to kill the Jews of Persia. Tisha B'Av is the holiday that occurs in the summer at one of the longest days. We have, Tisha B'Av happens usually late July, early August. And it's the day that we commemorate the destruction of the 2 temples in Jerusalem and a number of other atrocities and tragedies that happened throughout Jewish history. And we observe Tisha B'Av with a 25-hour fast. So we begin in the evening and then fast for a full 25 hours. And it's significant because it is often a very, very long, hot day. We have Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we observe in the spring, Yom HaZikaron, which is Israeli Memorial Day, and then Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Israeli Independence Day. And I will say about 5 and 6, Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, and Israeli Independence Day, that these particular holidays of history and holidays of remembrance are observed in many, many different ways. Any community that you go to will have a different approach to celebrating these 2 days. And I'll say So my second year of rabbinical school, I studied in Jerusalem. That was a requirement, part of the program. And for both Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, I was fortunate enough to be part of a group that participated actually in joint Israeli and Palestinian Memorial Day commemorations, and also the Independence Day celebrations, which are, you know, in Israel, a very joyous, happy day, but also a very complicated and tragic day for Palestinian communities. And I just want to name that there are groups both in Israel and Palestine, but also here in America, that try as best as they possibly can to do joint programs to sort of acknowledge the pain on both sides. It's tricky and not possible everywhere you go, but it's important to mention that those groups, those coexistence groups, do exist, and they're happening in Israel. So Shabbat, which I said before is a weekly holiday, right? We have Friday night and Saturday morning. And again, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his book, The Sabbath, which was a groundbreaking work on the Sabbath, what it means to observe the Sabbath and what the experience of observing Sabbath is and could be for us, but also for God. And Heschel says 6 days a week, we seek to dominate the world. And on the seventh day, we try to dominate the self. And on Shabbat, we have 25 hours of rest, beginning Friday evening and concluding after nightfall on Saturday. And you may be noticing a pattern that many of the Jewish holidays, almost all of them, actually begin in the evening and conclude at nightfall the next day. They are a full 25 hours. And I want to talk about the rituals of Shabbat. Maybe we'll go through those, and then I'll talk a little bit about how Shabbat looks differently for different people. So we begin Shabbat with a service called Kabbalat Shabbat, which literally means welcoming in or taking on Shabbat, accepting Shabbat into our lives. And we read Psalms and we sing. In our congregation, it's usually a very intimate service. We sit around our table in the library and we sing, we read poetry. It's a lovely way to set an intention for the next 25 hours. And then you go home and you light Shabbat candles. Traditionally, people light two candles, but you may light more. If you're having guests, you might set up candles for your guests to light. But it's a really beautiful way to sort of bring some light into the beginning of Shabbat. And also, if you've had a particularly challenging week, I always find that I can sort of take a breath once we light Shabbat candles, that to me signals a shift in the way that I feel and in the way that I want to spend the next 25 hours. And then we have Shabbat dinner, just a festive meal, usually with a loaf or two of challah bread, which is great. And my 2-year-old all week long talks about Shabbat and challah. Can I have challah? Can I have challah? And we say, it's special for Shabbat. So we really try to reserve it as something special, a little treat for Shabbat, for the weekend. There is also a commandment, really a teaching in Jewish tradition, that Shabbat is a special opportunity for intimacy, whether that's with partners or friends, but it's a special time where there's a different kind of opportunity for connection, for closeness. So I always encourage people to, pick up the phone and call someone you haven't talked to in a while, or just send someone a text just to say, I'm thinking about you and wishing you a Shabbat Shalom. And then we come back to services on Saturday morning. And for anyone here who's been to OZS, our main weekly service is on Saturday morning. We have, we meet for all of our services, but we get a pretty small crowd on Friday nights. Like I said, it's more intimate. But Saturday morning, usually our sanctuary is close to full, and we have often a luncheon afterwards, and it's a really lovely time for a lot of the community to come together. And in our Shabbat morning service, we read Psalms, we sing different portions from the Torah. We have a specific Torah reading which we read through a story for that week, but it also enables us to honor people by calling them up to the Torah to make a special blessing. We do our reading from the prophets, the Haftorah reading, and then you're really meant to just spend the rest of the day resting, disconnecting from technology. Again, maybe it's calling a friend or doing something that really just brings you lots of joy and pleasure. There are some places where, depending on how traditionally you observe and interpret Jewish law, some things that you might do that you find very meaningful and fun might actually come into conflict with how the law says that we're supposed to observe Shabbat. But I think my perspective is that especially because of the world that we live in, and we are glued to our phones and we are constantly interfacing with horrible news, which we have a responsibility to know about and to be apprised of and to be trying to do something about. But we really need Shabbat. And so my take is that if the thing that makes you feel good and gives you a sense of pause and healing in this broken world is something that maybe the rabbis of old would say that actually wasn't a true observance of Shabbos, of Shabbat, I would say go do it anyway. Everyone is entitled to and empowered to create their own vision of Shabbat. And when we come together in our sanctuary, when we come together for services, we have norms and we have guidelines and frameworks for how we publicly and communally observe these things. But it's important, I think, for me and for our community to know that Shabbat can take on lots of different iterations. It can look differently for different people. And so this is also a very countercultural thing and something that we should all strive to observe. And even if you observe on Sunday rather than Saturday, Shabbat is sort of I think, a port in the storm for us living in this modern world. So Jewish prayer, also by a show of hands, has anyone ever been to a Jewish service? Doesn't matter what kind of synagogue, but great, thank you. So again, Rabbi Heschel says, prayer is our humble answer to the inconceivable surprise of living. And we, in Jewish tradition, tend to think about prayer in two separate categories that also hopefully come together at certain points. And that is, the Hebrew word is keva, which means sort of fixed structure, right? You have daily services that you're obligated to participate in. They happen at certain times of day. There's a fixed liturgy for much of these services. So that would be the keva, the structure, the sort of guiding framework that anyone who's encountering Jewish prayer would recognize. And then the kavanah, which means intention or spontaneity, which can be sort of in the middle of a service, breaking out in ecstatic dance or song, or you're hiking or you're kayaking, or you're driving through the Southwest and you feel moved. You feel deeply spiritual, maybe not necessarily in a religious sense, but you feel that you are encountering and interacting with something larger than yourself. And maybe you just are talking, or you're talking to God, or whatever it might be. And the rabbis, rabbis of Jewish tradition, I think were wise to caution us against always seeking the spontaneous, because that, I think, is a pretty impossible threshold, right? If every prayer encounter and opportunity for prayer that we had was supposed to be life-changing and so moving that we are just, moved to tears, or hugging a stranger, that is not realistic. Hopefully that happens, but it's not so realistic. And so the rabbis, I think, wisely pair the structure, the sort of formality, with the hope that you can eventually attain this more spontaneous, sort of joyful experience of prayer. And I love this so much. I think it's such an important insight that the rabbis bring to us, which is that they say, because some people also hate the structure, they hate the framework, they say, that's not spiritual, that's not moving. And so they say, well, I don't want to participate in that because it's not this sort of more elevated experience of prayer. But what the rabbis teach us is that if you commit to the routine, to the habit of regularly praying or praying with community at these regular prescribed times, that is actually what helps you get to the spontaneous, to the joyful, to the soulful kind of prayer. And we have 3 daily prayer services: Shachrit, which is the morning service; Mincha, which is the afternoon service; and Ma'ariv, which is the evening service. And we have a variety of these services at the synagogue, but in order to pray the full liturgy, we require what's called a minyan or a minyan, which is a quorum of 10 people, 10 Jewish people. And our community in Lexington, our Jewish community, is pretty small. And so we can't always get to 10 if we're meeting every day, 3 times a day. So we have decided, Shabbat is very important, Jewish holidays are very important. And then once a week, we have either an afternoon or an evening service, depending on what time of year it is and how early the sun goes down. I didn't put the notes on the slide, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of garb that Jewish people wear when we're praying. And when I Google searched these 2 items, I could only find men, and I could actually only find older rabbis who were very traditional, like long beards and black hats. And that actually is more representative of the community that I come from, that I was raised in, but it's not representative of who I am now or where our Lexington Jewish community sits. So I actually, included a picture of me because I couldn't find another one on the internet that was more egalitarian. And this is actually a picture from our first daughter's baby naming at the synagogue. But if you can see, I'm wearing a prayer shawl, which is called a talit. And I'm also wearing tefillin, phylacteries, which are, we have a leather box that goes on your forehead, just between your eyes, and on your forearm, your forearm opposite your heart, your bicep. And these are ritual objects that everyone wears. The prayer shawl, the talit, we wear for every service, weekday, Shabbat, holidays, everything. The phylacteries, the black leather boxes, are only for weekday prayer. We don't wear them on Shabbat. It's actually considered forbidden to put them on Shabbat. But during the week, if you stumbled into a service, you would encounter people, not everyone, but people in that congregation would be wearing a talit, a prayer shawl, and the tefillin. And in the community that I grew up in, only men could wear these objects. And it's really, really powerful to be at our congregation and be in a place that's fully egalitarian, because anyone who wants, who's Jewish, is able to fully participate in an embodied prayer experience, right? Anyone who is eligible, it's not a very spiritual word, but anyone who's able ritually to wear these objects can, and that's a very powerful thing. And when kids in our congregation turn 13, we celebrate their B'nai Mitzvah. They're sort of coming into the Jewish community and into Jewish communal obligation formally and in front of the congregation. And oftentimes we'll have the parents of the student come up onto the pulpit and actually present their child with the talit, with the prayer shawl, for the very first time. And they will actually together say the blessing that I led at the beginning of our session this afternoon. And it's a really beautiful moment of sort of handing something tangible down through the generations, and also enabling people to pray in sort of the fullness that our tradition allows. So before we go into questions, I wanted to share one final quote from Heschel. And he gave this teaching. He said this in one final interview before he passed away in the 70s. And again, Abraham Joshua Heschel was someone who transformed Jewish life, and I think transformed the ways that Jews think about who we are and who we are vis-a-vis American society. Abraham Joshua Heschel marched in Selma with Dr. King, and it's not the quote that I brought here, but he said that when I was marching, I was praying with my feet. And there are incredible photos and interviews of that moment and teachings that came out of that moment. But he is someone who almost singularly, I think, changed how progressive Jews think about what it means to be a religious person in the 20th and 21st century and in America. And he said, and this is what I want to finish with, he said, remember that there is meaning beyond absurdity. Be sure that every deed counts, that every word has power, and that we all can do our share to redeem the world in spite of all absurdities and all frustrations and all disappointments. And above all, remember to build a life as if it were a work of art. So I think that's a good place for us to end with the presentation piece. But I just thank you all so much for this wonderful opportunity to share a little bit about our community and how we think about our faith and our practice. Really wonderful to be with all of you, and I'm open to questions, and there's really no question that's off the table. Yeah, Deborah was asking, what is the difference between a temple and a synagogue? It's such a good question, and it's a perfect Lexington question, because here we have two Jewish congregations. We have Temple Adath Israel, which people in town colloquially refer to as the temple. And then we have Ohavay Zion, which is where I'm the rabbi, which people colloquially refer to as the synagogue. And I'm glad you asked, because when I came to town, I didn't know that. And where I grew up in Chicago, where there are dozens of synagogues. And every Jewish place of worship was a synagogue. There was no distinction. Maybe their names were different, Temple Adath Israel, but you would call it a synagogue. And so when I got to Lexington, there was a sort of, people belong to Temple Adath Israel, they belong to the synagogue, and they refer to those two places as such. So I say that because that's something that's very live here in the Jewish community, sort of referring to two Jewish places of worship very differently. For the most part, and it's not true fully across the board, but oftentimes a temple will be a Reform congregation and a synagogue will be a conservative or an Orthodox congregation. You might also hear the term shul, S-H-U-L, which is Yiddish for synagogue. So some people might say, you might hear in our community, oh, I'm going to shul. That's just another way to say I'm going to synagogue. But more often than not, temple will be affiliated with the Reform, and synagogue is conservative or Orthodox. So one of the things that happened when I got here is that I was referring to the synagogue, or I would say synagogue, meaning Temple Adath Israel, and no one would get offended, but people would just say, oh, you must be new to Lexington, because you don't know how we talk about these places. But it's a great question, because the terminology that you use to refer to a Jewish place of worship has no bearing in ritual or theological difference, so no one would take offense. It just might be something that sort of culturally and sociologically happened over time. Yeah. A conversation about denominations itself we could have a whole course on that over the course of a whole year. Chabad falls under the category of an Orthodox denomination. They have a very interesting approach to Judaism. We have a small Chabad presence here at the University of Kentucky, but Chabad is famous for actually going out and doing, it's not exactly mission, it's not a perfect translation. The Hebrew word is shlichut, which means to go out and be a messenger of, which is essentially doing missionary work. But they go out, families who belong to the Chabad movement will go to places where there are very few Jews or very little organized Jewish infrastructure. So this takes place mainly on college campuses, but also all over the world. So if you're in Thailand or in Melbourne, Australia, and you don't have to be Jewish to be involved with Chabad, but if you're a Jewish person in need of a service or a kosher meal, right? If you want to eat kosher food, chances are that at any place you find yourself on the globe, there is likely a Chabad, and their job really is to help Jews who otherwise wouldn't have community to have access to the resources that they need. In a lot of places, Chabad has wonderful, friendly, cooperative relationships with other synagogues and denominations, and they in bigger Jewish communities are just a part of sort of the fabric of Jewish life. For example, in Chicago, there are dozens of Reform and Conservative and Orthodox and Chabad congregations, and you can really take your pick and go wherever feels best. But yeah, if you're traveling somewhere or you find yourself in a remote place, then you likely will encounter Chabad. They also, and I am not an expert on this, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but they have they think about Judaism and Jewish thought in some people call it a more messianic sense. And one thing that they do, and they do very effectively, and it's actually a beautiful thing, is that they really encourage anyone who's Jewish to do as many mitzvot, as many good deeds as possible. So if you've ever been riding the subway in New York City, you might come out from the subway station and see a table where a couple Chabad people are encouraging people to actually put on tefillin, the black straps that were in the photo earlier, because they think, and it's a really powerful idea, that every good deed that we do gets us one step closer to bringing the Messiah, to sort of bringing the world perfected into reality. And there is a Chabad presence here in Lexington. And if you're curious about that, he is definitely more of an expert on it than I am. So I encourage you to be in touch with him also. Rabbi Shlomo Litvin is who you can talk to about that. Yeah, please. The question is, are we seeing in Jewish community a sort of decline in engagement and membership? Are we thriving, or are we shrinking in similar ways as the mainline Christian churches are? And the short answer is yes. But I think, so yeah, I'll maybe take a step back and sort of, because there's so much to talk about in response to this question. I think from the sort of administrative level, when it comes to the organized Jewish world and the umbrella organizations and the people who are like collecting data on growth in Jewish communities and things like that, I think there really is a sense that synagogue membership and communal participation and just general engagement in religious life is in decline. And I think there's lots of legitimate panic, but some panic that, at least from my perspective as a relative newcomer to a congregation in Lexington, doesn't always feel true in all of the ways that I think the wider sociological world wants to suggest. And what I mean by that is that our synagogue, I think our numbers are slightly down from what they have been in the past, but we are also, as all of us are, still in a lot of ways coming out of COVID and learning how to rebuild after being closed for so long, and really telling people to stay away. And so to me, I think our congregation really feels like it's growing and it's thriving. But I also think that we're unique because there are only 2 Jewish congregations in Lexington, whereas in places like Chicago or New York, where there are, again, dozens and dozens of synagogues, people are much more spread out and have many more options, which means that, and for us, like if you want to be engaged Jewishly in Lexington, you have 2 choices. And we're actually in a period of growth right now. I'm just looking at some members of our congregation who are here. We're in a period of growth, but the generational question about how to engage younger people, and not only younger people with kids, but younger single people who are in town who are looking for community. That's a question that's live for us very much. We recently, and all of this was happening before I came, but I also came again in the middle of COVID. We recently started to offer babysitting again during Saturday morning services, because one piece of feedback that we were hearing pretty regularly from parents was, well, I can't possibly participate in services. I don't have childcare on that day. So we started to provide childcare, and that has seemed to help. We also have a small but very active religious school. And we found that that's been a really wonderful source for membership growth, and people who are unaffiliated are enrolling their children and then deciding to join the congregation, because that is a really natural and meaningful entry point for them. But yes, we are absolutely grappling with the same questions. And it would be, again, as a relative newcomer to Lexington, as a newcomer to the interfaith world of Lexington, I think it would be great to be something that we were talking about together. It's a great question. So the question is, I mentioned duty and obligation quite a bit throughout the presentation, and Melissa was just asking if I could speak a little bit more about that choice and the centrality of those things to Judaism. The first thing I'll say is more personal and biographical, which is having grown up in the Orthodox community, where obligation and adherence to Jewish law is central. That really is the thing that binds communities. It's a central part of my story, and also how I was raised and socialized in my Judaism. And so actually being part of a non-Orthodox and more ritually progressive Judaism is something that's relatively new for me still. So it's interesting that you picked up on, the piece of my own story that comes through when I talk about Judaism. But for us, for conservative Jews, ritual obligation and adherence to Jewish law is also central and primary to our understanding of Judaism. And we also, I think, honestly acknowledge that actually might not speak to everyone. For example, my family doesn't drive on Saturdays, on Friday nights and Saturdays once Shabbat has started. So we live within walking distance of the synagogue. And that means that, rain or shine through a snowstorm, we walk, and we live pretty close, so it's easy. But for many people, that is not possible or something that they want, to live in that neighborhood. And this is a good example because in 1957, and this actually, Lisa, links back up to your question about synagogue decline. In the 50s, synagogues before that had primarily been located in urban areas, and that was true here too. Synagogues were downtown, where there was much more housing and much more affordable housing. And Jewish communities, regardless of denomination, were in the habit of, you were part of a community of people who walked to synagogue, and you would see Jews walking together, and that was part of the experience of Shabbat and holidays. And then synagogues started, and I wonder if this is true of churches as well, and mosques, but synagogues started to move into the suburbs. And at that time, and still, that was financially out of reach for a lot of people who were otherwise very involved and active in the synagogue. And so the conservative movement they did a lot of research into Jewish law, and particularly around observance of Sabbath. And they wrote a paper, a responsum, that ultimately decided that you could drive to services. You could use your car, which before then would have been something considered forbidden to do on Shabbat. You can drive, you can get in your car, you can violate maybe some of the more traditional understandings of Sabbath observance if it's enabling you to come to synagogue, to participate. If not getting in your car and driving is going to keep you away and sort of lead to just a disintegration of your Jewish or religious life, then we're willing to say that that's okay for that specific purpose. And so that's an example of our movement sort of responding to what is sometimes the conflict between interpretation of Jewish law and like the reality of life for Jews at any particular moment. But the way that the conservative movement arrived at that decision wasn't just, well, we see that this is happening and this seems like something that we need to do to keep our membership numbers up. They very, very intentionally and over the course of a long time researched all of the relevant rabbinic sources that had something to say, the biblical sources that have something to say about how Shabbat is traditionally observed. And then they came to a conclusion. And then the other piece, and this is probably it's a very long answer because it's a really important and big question, is that every time our movement publishes a policy paper, essentially, saying, yes, it's permitted now to drive on Shabbat, or here's a way that we are a little bit more flexible when it comes to, using Zoom on Saturdays was a big question in terms of using technology on Shabbat, which is not something that we typically did before. For every, affirmative policy paper that gets published within our movement, there are I don't want to say an equal number, but there are always rabbis who are writing dissenting papers, dissenting opinions. And congregations in our movement actually have the option, once an opinion or these two divergent opinions are on the books, it's up to congregations and individual rabbis to choose which decision actually meets the needs of my congregation. And so I have colleagues who are at very Jewishly progressive conservative congregations in places like Chicago or New York, where everyone lives near the synagogue. So the question of driving to synagogue is not relevant for them. So their synagogue policy is that, unless obviously for a medical need or if there's just an extenuating circumstance, that would always be allowed. But I have colleagues who live in places where the question of, I'm not going to come to services unless I can drive is not relevant. So they've decided as a community that they don't hold by that decision or that opinion that was put out by the movement. But we try our best to ground everything that we do in a traditional understanding of Jewish law. And then I'll just really quickly, I'm going on and on about this answer, but really quickly about obligation. So we know from the combination of the biblical sources and later rabbinic texts that there are 613 commandments. That number gets thrown around a lot. And very, very traditional people would say every single Jewish person is obligated to observe all 613 of those commandments. Many of them actually are specific to service in the temple in Jerusalem or the agricultural cycle in the land of Israel in antiquity. And so they're not relevant to us as modern people. But we really, as conservative Jews and as Orthodox Jews, really see ourselves as obligated in as much of those mitzvot as are relevant to our lives. And so there is a sense of duty and obligation. But I think my own background and biography probably colors the way that I talk about it a little. So I'm really glad that you asked, Melissa. Yes, thank you, Lee. So the question was about the Hebrew language and specifically, it's true of modern Hebrew also, but I think your question is about biblical Hebrew, which is that it's a much smaller, more truncated vocabulary in terms of volume than the English language. But each word within the biblical Hebrew vocabulary actually has multiple meanings. And does that impact, debate or difference in interpretation and just how we read the Bible? And the answer is absolutely yes. And we also have a very robust tradition of commentary of exegesis on the biblical text, but also on later rabbinic works. And there's one commentary in particular, Abraham ibn Ezra. He was writing in the medieval period, the early medieval period, and he was a linguist by training. And so when he approaches, a word that seems odd or out of place, or a whole phrase or verse that grammatically is a little bit strange, he comes at that reading with a linguistic background, all to say that the ability to read maybe more expansively, but also in conversation with other people reading and have a really spirited debate about the meaning, is something that's built into not just how we as modern people read the Bible, but even the people who are making the earliest comments, and not amendments, but in Jewish tradition, it's the commentaries that really give the biblical text its texture. There's a whole category of homiletics called midrash, which the sort of colloquial way to describe it would be rabbinic narrative. So if there's it comes up, there's so much of it in Jewish tradition, but one of the places where it comes up most prominently is around the story of the binding of Isaac. And after Abraham and Isaac, after the whole ordeal, the Bible says that they walk down the mountain silently, and then we actually never see them interact again. And that's the end of that portion. And the very beginning of the next portion is the death of Sarah. And so to us, reading on the surface, it might be interesting, but there's a big gap. There's all this stuff that seems to have happened that wasn't recorded. And so the midrash, the sort of rabbinic storytellers, come into that blank space, and not to say this is for sure what happened, but given some of the language in these verses, some of the specific words and grammatical structure, given maybe other things we know from other people who have commented on this particular text, we can sort of craft a narrative that fills in the blanks. And one of the, it's just coming to mind, but one of the midrashim, one of these stories about that moment, says that Abraham and Isaac came down the mountain, and when Sarah heard what happened, she was so distraught and devastated that she died. She died of a broken heart, because it was just such a trauma that happened to their family. And so the only way that midrash can exist, and that sort of rabbinic storytelling, is if there's disagreement or debate about what the meaning of the text actually is. So it's a very important and robust part of how we read our Bible. Yeah, thank you, Lee. Peter's asking, he had attended a service at OZS and noticed that we sing a lot, but we don't use instruments. So for us, that decision, and this sort of brings all of the questions together in a really nice way. In the biblical understanding of what Sabbath observance is, at least in Jewish tradition, the things that are prohibited are actually the things that the Israelites and the priests and the Levites did. It's the sort of manual labor that they did in the tabernacle and in the temple. So things like weaving and dyeing and tying knots and fixing things. That's where the Jewish tradition draws, well, I'll say it a little bit differently. The things that are forbidden on Shabbat are parallel to the physical and manual work and labor that was done in the tabernacle and in the temple. And it's a category called the 39 milachot, the 39 sort of forbidden acts of work. And fixing objects is one of the prohibitions of Shabbat in the Hebrew Bible. And so the decision not to use instruments stems from that prohibition. we can talk about the actual source. I can try to find it for you, but the rabbis, well, I'm going to back up and do a little bit of a broad, big picture kind of answer, and then get to your specific question, because it's important. If you read in Jewish communities, we talk a lot about, if you just read the biblical text at face value, it doesn't necessarily teach you very much about what to do and how to actually observe the law. So the main example, the most prevalent example of this is around the laws of kosher. The Hebrew Bible says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. But my family, for example, we observe kosher in such a way that we don't mix meat and milk. But we interpret that to mean that we actually have separate dishes for meat and milk. And we run the dishwasher on separate cycles. We don't mix those things in the dishwasher. We look for special kosher certifications. And so, but none of that is evident from just the verse, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. And so in Judaism, the rabbinic tradition emerged similar to Midrash to sort of make sense of those verses, but also create a system of law and observance. So the rabbis come later and they say, oh, this verse means, don't mix your plate. I mean, we can sort of joke about it. We joke about it in Jewish community that the rabbis probably didn't intend for everyone to have 4 different sets of silverware and dishes and whatever. And also, I'll to say that you're all welcome to come over to my house for a meal anytime to sort of see a kosher kitchen in action. But the rabbis sort of step in and build more texture, for lack of a better way of describing it, to the plain biblical meaning. So the rabbis interpreted this prohibition against fixing things, or this action that was done in the temple of fixing things, to mean you can't use something on Shabbat that is liable to break, or that might break, for fear that you might want to repair it on Shabbat. And so instruments are part of this, that your guitar string might snap, and so you might be inclined in the moment to fix it. Another place where this comes up is riding a bike on Shabbat, because your gears might come undone and you might stop and fix it. I say that with the caveat that the question of whether or not we should use instruments in our synagogue is actually something we talk about all the time, because we know that, we do a lot of singing, and instruments would probably enhance the singing quite a bit. And so this is another example of a moment where we have the law and the traditional interpretation of the law, and sort of the decision that's been made about instruments for the movement. But we also have our preference and our desire to enhance worship and singing and synagogue life. So that's a good example of another place where those two things are in conflict. There's one holiday that I didn't mention. It comes at the end of the high holiday season, Simchat Torah, where we celebrate concluding the yearly cycle of Torah reading, and we have a great big party. We have a dance party, we do lots of circle dancing, and we sing, and it's really joyous, and we bring kids and families into it. And even though it's a holiday that usually requires a higher level of observance from us at the synagogue, we have someone playing music, playing a piano. Because that also, Lisa, to your point earlier about engagement, that is one of the times where it's a fully multi-generational moment and celebration at the congregation. And it feels like having some musical accompaniment is going to be the thing that makes it really sweet and really memorable. So we're like a little bit flexible when it comes to that particular piece of observance. Yes, it's a really good question. And I'm sorry I answered it in a very, very rabbinic to answer a question with lots of other questions. generally speaking, and that was one of the things that when the Reform movement emerged in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, they made the decision to sort of do away with, not with participation in or conversation about traditional Jewish law, but it wasn't going to be one of the things that bound them. So the Reform movement, I'm painting with a broad brush right now, but does not approach Jewish law in the same way as conservative or Orthodox Jews do. But even within the Reform movement, there is a lot of diversity. So, I know plenty of Reform Jews who are very strict about keeping kosher or how they observe Shabbat. And I also know an equal number of conservative and Orthodox Jews who don't really keep kosher, or don't feel that that is something that brings lots of meaning to their life in terms of their observance. And so, yeah, I would say that from a movement perspective, the Reform communities don't engage or, they don't feel bound by Jewish law in quite the same way. And it's just every congregation is so different. And yeah, it's interesting. I think if you were to do a poll of the people who belong to both congregations here in town, I would say that, or I would guess that many, many people observe their Judaism very, very similarly, even though they choose to affiliate with two different congregations. Yeah. Judaism we don't believe that Jesus was a prophet or that he is the Son of God, but he is a Jew, and we think of him as a very important and charismatic rabbi and teacher, and certainly also the progenitor of Christianity. So he, even though we don't approach Jesus in a religious sense, and he's not part of our religious canon or one of our icons, you might say, there's not denial within Jewish tradition that Jesus was in fact a real person and a really important person in the history of the emergence of Western or Abrahamic religion. And then just I want to address the comment you made about chosenness, which is, and I'm really, really glad that you asked, because this is something, the idea of chosenness is something that makes modern Jews really uncomfortable. And it's something that we are, I wouldn't say that it's something we're like always talking about at the synagogue, but I think a lot of people, myself included, struggle with that kind of particularism. And there's a lot of literature that came and is still being written from a Jewish perspective about how to understand that and also how to push back against it. And one of the, just want to make sure I get it right. The Reconstructionist Jewish denomination that was created in America in the 20s by Mordecai Kaplan. One of their core tenets is that they actually reject the notion of Jewish chosenness. And I say that just to say that there is a mainstream Jewish approach that says, actually, we're all in, and I would actually say, and I would hope that all Jews would agree with what I'm about to say, which is that we are all created in the image of God and endowed with a special kind of chosenness that might, I don't personally believe that there's only one pot of chosenness for one particular kind of people. Like, I think Jews can be chosen in a very specific kind of way, that Muslims are chosen, that Christians are chosen, that we all have a specific and unique and importantly different relationship with God and with our tradition. And there's also, and maybe this is something I can forward along to you, Addison, to send out to the group, but recently there have been changes to Jewish liturgy that include, so the most important example that I can think of, or the most frequent example, is there's a prayer that we say, it's called the Mourner's Kaddish, which is a prayer that people who are in mourning will recite in the presence of a community. And we also, there's a different iteration of that same text that we say at different points throughout a service to sort of end one part of a service and move us to the next one. And the traditional text at the very end, it ends with a sort of, may God bless the Jewish people. And there have been recent innovations, and you can actually see this reflected in our prayer book that says, may God bless the Jewish people and all of humanity, and all people of the world. And so there have been really, and there continues to be important scholarship pushing back against that. And I think, and I'm sure this is true everywhere and regardless of what faith you belong to, that it's just true that there are people who will be more closed-minded about that idea, and then people who will be more open about it. So I don't want to say that, I don't want to speak on behalf of all kinds of Jewish people and say that it's impossible for you to encounter a Jewish person who believes wholeheartedly and universally that only Jewish people are chosen. But in the non-Orthodox world, and even in some corners of the modern Orthodox world, like that idea is starting to change and starting to, the discomfort that Jews feel around it is starting to become a little bit more out in the open. Yeah, which is also just, and again, I'm a newcomer to this group and to Lexington, and it's why these conversations are so important. So yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. So the way that I was taught, just from a historical perspective, and I did not study Christianity, and so I certainly don't mean to step on toes or offend with what I'm about to say, but my understanding was that, and I think all Jews would agree that Jesus was crucified. And my understanding was that, the Romans were putting lots of people to death at that time, and crucifixion was how they executed people. But I didn't learn that story from it wasn't a religious origin story of mine or my community. So I learned it from a more historical and academic perspective. But I think most Jews would agree that Jesus was crucified. Maybe not for a religious purpose, but yeah. Yeah, thank you. So Melissa asked about a little bit more about Midrash, and about if Midrash is used primarily to settle a disagreement between commentators or even internally within the text, or is Midrash something that just gives, not just, but gives context and texture and expands the biblical text? I think it's both. There are places where, the story of the binding of Isaac is just so rich and so ripe for storytelling that I think it could be both in that case, because there are, and again, this could be a whole class, but there's a whole academic study of Midrash, and scholars have identified a couple different, I think it's 12 actually, methodological principles that the Midrashic authors use to write, but also to help guide what it is they're going to write. And just with the binding of Isaac, it's on my mind because we read it on Rosh Hashanah. So it's coming up in a couple weeks. One of the principles that they have is called smichut, which in Hebrew means closeness or connection. And the rabbis will often look at the end of one portion and say, okay, what's happening here? And what's happening at the very beginning of the next? What's the next sentence about? How are they related? And if they are seemingly unrelated, how are we going to try to make a connection between the two? And so with the binding of Isaac, it's just the example that comes to mind because the way that we divide our Torah portions ends very abruptly with, Abraham and Isaac just come down the mountain. And as readers, we're like, that's a cliffhanger. That's a crazy place to end that story. Because if you're reading it closely, we've all gone through the trauma that Abraham and Isaac just went through. And then again, the very beginning of the next section is Sarah's death. And so there are many, many midrashim about why that connection is there and why the authors of the biblical text didn't choose to connect those two moments more directly or didn't start a few sentences later. So I think it's both. And then when we get actually to the less narrative portions of the Torah, of the Bible, like Leviticus and some sections in Deuteronomy and Numbers that are very heavy with law, you have, there's a category of midrash called midrash halacha, which means midrash about law, about Jewish law. And then the other category, which would be more applicable to the story of the binding of Isaac, is midrash agadah, which means midrashic narrative, more story-based. So it's both, and it would depend on what section they're commenting on. So Jim asked if I could say a little bit more about the imperfection of God. Yes, that approach to theology, I will just share personally, is also relatively new to me because I grew up in a community and in a tradition where we never questioned God and the way God acted in the world. And so much so that when there was tragedy, oftentimes the community would respond with, well, it's God's plan and we don't understand God's plan. And I know many, many people for whom that is very comforting. But in my own life and in some tragic experiences within my family, when I heard that, it just, and I lost my mom 5 years ago, and I was already in rabbinical school. I was already part of the non-Orthodox world and thinking a little bit more expansively about theology. And I remember after she died, a teacher of mine said, "This is God's plan. This is how it's supposed to be." And I think maybe there is a higher order theological truth to that I do believe. And as a pastoral encounter, that was absolutely the wrong thing to say to someone who just lost a parent. And so I think that opened up for me. And I never really have had a crisis of faith or been someone who fully rejected relationship with God. But I think for me, in order to stay in relationship with God, I needed to be angry and needed to be able to say, this was a horrible thing that God let happen. And also it's not, there's a lot of post-Holocaust theology and lots of Jewish thinkers and there's a lot of scholarship and really writing from the heart from survivors of the Holocaust and Jewish theologians and philosophers from that time period who really try to grapple with where God was in that moment and how a perfect God could allow that to happen. And I think we could apply that question to lots of other tragedies and things that happen in the world. And so it's become, sort of a thread that I preach often, just the imperfection of God. But I also am very careful to say that it doesn't mean that we are rejecting God or repudiating that God has a plan that we don't understand. Just to be sort of in process with our relationship with God a little bit more. Process. Yeah. Stu was asking if the different denominations in the Jewish world get along. I would say here in Lexington, yes, very much. We at OZS, we have a lovely and very collaborative relationship with the Temple Adat Israel, and my colleague, Rabbi David Werchapter. Beyond Lexington, and again, we're unique in that it's sort of unusual for a Jewish community not to have a large Orthodox presence. But we don't have a Jewish day school. There are no kosher restaurants, which is really a bummer. But this isn't, it's a wonderful community, but if you are more traditionally observant, this isn't really a place where you would consider moving, which I think is a shame, but that's the reality. But outside of sort of smaller Jewish communities that are not on the coasts like us, the conservative and reform congregations tend to be partners and do more because they have more flexibility when it comes to religious observance and even what it means to host a religious event together in shared space. There's more openness around those questions, whereas the Orthodox community, just because they have different limits and different thresholds for what is religiously acceptable to them. And the place where this actually plays out the most is in conversions to Judaism. So an Orthodox congregation or an Orthodox community would not accept as legitimate a conservative conversion or a reform conversion to Judaism. The conservative movement accepts reform conversion. So if someone converted to Judaism through the Reform congregation here and came to us and said, I converted through the Reform movement, we would say, you're fully eligible to be a member here. And we would accept their conversion. And the same is true in a Reform congregation. They would accept Orthodox or conservative conversions. But that is a place that sort of the social cooperation or aspirational love that different Jewish denominations have for each other breaks down, because we could sort of debate about interpretations of the Bible or Jewish law, and that is sort of, it's petty and doesn't always have like real lived implications for people. Whereas when someone comes to your community and they say, I'm Jewish, and then you say, well, can you prove it? Or did you convert with the right person? And do they follow my exact process for how I would, if I were your teacher, how I would guide you through the conversion process? That is really harmful and hurts people and pushes people away. So yeah, it's an ongoing, I think conversion is like the most, it's the biggest place where that comes up and often the most painful. But yeah, there are other places, negotiating what food is kosher and what you can do on a Saturday in a building, things like that. But I would, as a clergy representative of the Jewish people, I would like to say that we really try to get along. Yeah, but it's different from place to place for sure.